Charlotte sat quietly in seat 8A, her eyes closed as she enjoyed the rare chance to rest. The long flight from New York to Tokyo was a welcomed break from her busy life. She was used to the constant demands of running her own company, making deals, and managing her vast wealth. But on this flight, she was just like any other passenger, relaxed and in no rush. She wore a simple jacket, her long dark hair tied back loosely, blending in with the other travelers. Her gaze rested on the soft cloud cover outside the window. The hum of the engines was the only sound that filled the cabin. She was comfortable in this moment of silence. The world beyond her seat was a blur, just how she liked it. Her wealth was a secret on this flight. Only a few people knew her identity, and she liked it that way. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering drinks and snacks. The plane was cruising smoothly above the clouds, and all seemed normal. But that sense of calm was broken suddenly when the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are currently cruising at an altitude of 35,000 feet. We have a bit of an unusual request today. If there are any combat pilots on board, could you please make yourself known?" Charlotte's eyes opened wide, her focus sharpening. A request for combat pilots? That was strange. Passengers exchanged confused glances. Was this some kind of joke or an emergency? The captain's voice continued, now with a slight urgency. "We are currently monitoring a situation, and we need assistance. If you have combat experience, please press the call button." Charlotte felt a ripple of unease spread through her. She had traveled many times, but this was the first time she had ever heard such a request. She glanced around the cabin. Most of the passengers were still looking at each other, unsure of what to do. A few pressed the call button, but no one seemed to know how to respond. Charlotte sat back, her mind racing. She had heard rumors of dangerous airspace in some parts of the world, but the captain's voice sounded calm yet strained, as if he was hiding something. She had always kept a low profile, but now, with this announcement, she felt exposed in a way she hadn't anticipated. As the minutes passed, the tension in the air grew. Charlotte's eyes narrowed. She wasn't just some rich businesswoman with no experience in tough situations. She had trained for self-defense, and she was no stranger to dealing with high-stakes scenarios. She had to stay alert. Whatever was happening, she knew it was no ordinary flight. Her thoughts were interrupted as a flight attendant passed by, her face pale. "Are you all right, miss?" she asked Charlotte, her voice trembling. Charlotte nodded, offering a polite smile. "I'm fine," she said, though she felt anything but fine. Something was happening, something serious. The attendant seemed to hesitate before continuing down the aisle, her eyes darting nervously toward the cockpit. Charlotte's mind was sharp now, processing everything: the strange request, the captain's voice, the flight attendant's unease. She had a feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. A low murmur spread through the cabin as more passengers began to press their call buttons. Charlotte kept her eyes on the front of the plane, where the cockpit door remained shut. What was really going on? She wasn't the type to panic. In fact, she rarely lost control of any situation. But this was different. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze now fixed on the flight attendants. They were whispering to each other, exchanging quick glances. The uncertainty was palpable. And then, as if in answer to her growing concerns, the captain's voice returned to the intercom. "We are experiencing a situation that requires immediate attention. Please remain calm. If there are any combat pilots on board, we need you to come forward now." Charlotte's heart raced. This was real. Whatever was happening, it was unfolding quickly. She glanced out the window again, half expecting to see fighter jets or some sign of danger. But there was nothing, just endless skies. She stood up slowly, feeling the eyes of the other passengers on her. As the billionaire businesswoman, Charlotte was used to being noticed, but this was different. This wasn't about her wealth. This was about survival. She needed to make a decision. The question was, how far was she willing to go to ensure her safety and the safety of those around her? Charlotte stood for a moment, unsure of what to do. The captain's voice had stirred something deep inside her, a sense of urgency she couldn't ignore. She glanced around the cabin once more, noting the tension in the air. Passengers were whispering to each other, their faces filled with worry. No one knew what was happening, but everyone could feel the shift. She hesitated for just a moment longer before walking toward the front of the plane. The flight attendants, who were normally calm and composed, were moving quickly down the aisle. Their hurried steps were a clear sign that something was off. Charlotte could feel their eyes following her as she made her way toward the cockpit, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't shake. When she reached the front, the flight attendant at the cockpit door looked at her, her face pale. "Miss, please go back to your seat," she said, her voice strained. Charlotte shook her head, keeping her voice steady. "I need to know what's happening. I'm not just any passenger here." The flight attendant's eyes widened, and she opened her mouth to say something, but the captain's voice cut through once more. "All passengers, please remain seated. If there are any combat pilots on board, we need your help immediately. This is not a drill." The tension in the cabin was now unbearable. Charlotte's heart raced. The captain's voice was calm, but there was a firmness to it that made it clear this was serious. She turned to the attendant again. "I need to speak to him," Charlotte said, her voice firm. "I can help." The flight attendant hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking nervously to the cockpit door. Then, with a reluctant nod, she stepped aside. Charlotte walked past her, her movements smooth and deliberate. As she passed, she could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, but she couldn't stop now. She had to know what was going on. The cockpit door opened just a crack, and Charlotte saw the captain. His eyes locked with hers for a brief moment before he spoke. "We're experiencing an emergency. There's no time for explanations. If you have the skills, we need you." Charlotte's brow furrowed. This was no longer a simple request. The situation was serious, and the captain was desperate. "I'm not a combat pilot," she said, her voice steady, but there was an edge of doubt in her words. "But I've had training. I've handled high-stress situations before." The captain nodded, his face unreadable. "We need someone who can think on their feet, someone who can take control. It's not just about flying this plane. It's about keeping everyone safe." Charlotte felt the weight of his words. She had always been in control of her own world, making decisions that affected millions. But this was different. The stakes were higher than anything she had ever faced. She couldn't back down now. She nodded, her mind quickly assessing the situation. Whatever was happening, it was beyond a simple emergency. Something serious was unfolding, and it was happening right above the clouds. "I'm in," she said, her voice firm. The captain didn't hesitate. He stepped aside, and Charlotte entered the cockpit. As soon as she stepped inside, the door shut behind her, and the atmosphere changed. The calm hum of the plane was replaced by a focused, intense energy. The captain sat at the controls, his hands steady on the joystick, but there was a hint of tension in his movements. The co-pilot was silent, eyes glued to the screens in front of him. They hadn't spoken much since Charlotte entered, but there was an understanding that whatever was happening outside, it was bigger than any of them had prepared for. "Take a seat," the captain said, his voice low. "We've got a situation." Charlotte sat down beside him, her eyes scanning the instruments. The dashboard was lit up with numbers and graphs she didn't fully understand, but she could see the changes in the readings. They were in the middle of something dangerous. What's going on? Charlotte asked, keeping her voice steady despite the growing unease in her stomach. The captain didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the radar. We've been rerouted. Something's in the airspace. We've been warned. We need to avoid it. Charlotte's mind raced. Avoid what? Her fingers tapped nervously on the armrest. Can you avoid it? Can we go around it? The captain nodded, his fingers moving quickly across the controls. We're trying. But if they're tracking us, we won't have much time. A new sense of urgency filled the cockpit. Charlotte's hands gripped the armrests. This was no longer a simple flight. They were being hunted, and the captain was doing everything he could to avoid confrontation. But she could sense the pressure mounting. What do you need me to do? Charlotte asked, her voice unwavering now. She was no longer the billionaire in 8A. She was someone who needed to make a difference. The captain's eyes flicked to her for a brief moment. Stay sharp. If anything goes wrong, we'll need you. She didn't ask any more questions. Instead, she kept her focus on the radar, trying to make sense of the data. They were about to enter a world she had never known before, and there would be no turning back. The tension inside the cockpit was almost unbearable. Charlotte sat rigidly beside the captain, her eyes glued to the radar screen. She had never imagined she'd be in a situation like this. The air outside was clear, but the warning lights flashing across the dashboard told a different story. They were being watched, tracked by something, or someone, that had the power to bring them down. The captain's hands flew across the controls, his eyes scanning the radar constantly. The co-pilot remained silent, absorbed in his own instruments, a look of concentration on his face. The only sound was the soft hum of the plane's engines and the occasional beep from the control panels. Charlotte swallowed hard, trying to keep her breathing steady. The captain was doing his best to keep them on course, but the growing sense of urgency in the cockpit was impossible to ignore. She had been in high-pressure situations before, but this was different. This wasn't a business deal or a boardroom decision. This was life and death. We're being followed, the captain muttered under his breath, his tone tight. They're closing in fast. Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. Who's following us? The captain didn't answer immediately, his focus on the controls. He adjusted the altitude and speed, trying to make the plane as unpredictable as possible. It doesn't matter. We can't outrun them, but we can make it harder for them to target us. She knew it was a dangerous game. She had no experience in combat flying, no knowledge of evading threats in the sky, but she understood strategy. The captain wasn't just flying this plane, he was thinking 3 or 4 steps ahead, calculating risks. Charlotte had built her empire on making quick, smart decisions in moments like this. The plane jolted slightly as the captain made a sharp turn. The lights on the radar flickered for a moment before returning to normal. Charlotte's eyes darted from the radar to the captain. Do you think they'll follow us into a storm? She asked. If we could hide in the clouds, we might have a chance. The captain glanced at her, surprised by her suggestion. He had obviously underestimated her. It's possible. But that storm is big. It'll slow us down, and it might make it harder for us to keep control. Charlotte's eyes narrowed as she watched the storm on the radar. It was a thick mass of clouds swirling below them, a perfect cover. But it was also unpredictable, dangerous. She knew this was a gamble, but at this point, they didn't have many options. We don't have much time, she said, her voice steady despite the tension. If we don't take the risk now, they'll catch up with us. The captain met her gaze. There was a brief moment of silence before he nodded. All right. We'll take the chance. Get ready. Charlotte could feel the change in the air as the captain adjusted their course toward the storm. The plane's engines hummed louder as they descended into the clouds. Charlotte's fingers tightened around the armrest, her mind racing. This wasn't just a flight anymore. It was a fight for survival. As they entered the storm, the plane shook, the turbulence making the journey feel like a constant struggle against the elements. Charlotte closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her breath. She was in this now. There was no turning back. She had made her decision, and the only thing she could do was trust the captain and hope for the best. The storm seemed to grow more intense as they flew deeper into it. The lights inside the cockpit flickered once, then twice. Charlotte could feel the plane being pushed by strong winds. She wasn't a pilot, but even she could tell that they were pushing the limits of what was safe. The shaking was becoming more violent, and the noise from the storm outside was deafening. "We're too close to the storm center," the co-pilot said suddenly, his voice full of concern. "We won't be able to stay in here much longer." Charlotte could feel the tension in the air, even more palpable now. The captain didn't answer, but his grip on the controls tightened. He was focused, determined, but even he knew they couldn't stay in the storm forever. It was a race against time. They needed to lose their pursuers before the storm got the better of them. Then, just as Charlotte thought they couldn't go any further, the storm seemed to part slightly. There was a break in the clouds, just enough for them to see a sliver of blue sky beyond. The captain made a sharp turn, pulling the plane out of the storm's heart. The turbulence eased, and the shaking stopped. Charlotte let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "We lost them," the captain said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For now." Charlotte felt a rush of relief flood through her, but it was short-lived. They had escaped the storm, but the danger wasn't over. Whoever was following them was still out there, and they would have to be prepared for whatever came next. "We can't stop now," Charlotte said. "We need to keep moving. Stay alert." The captain nodded, his focus never wavering. He had no intention of slowing down, not now. But Charlotte knew this was just the beginning. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. Charlotte felt the shift in the atmosphere once they left the storm behind. The sky was now a dull gray, the clouds heavy and thick, but the turbulence had stopped. The plane was gliding smoothly again. The engines hummed quietly, almost soothing in comparison to the chaos of moments before. But despite the calm, Charlotte knew they were far from safe. The captain and co-pilot were silent for a while, both of them scanning their instruments, checking the readings. Charlotte kept her eyes fixed on the horizon outside the cockpit window, trying to spot anything that could give them a hint about what lay ahead. "How long until we reach the next checkpoint?" Charlotte asked, breaking the silence. She knew they had to make it to a safer location, but the time seemed to stretch on forever. The captain glanced at the radar screen. "We're about an hour away, but we need to stay alert. Our pursuers are still out there. They won't give up that easily." Charlotte nodded. She knew it was true. It wasn't just about flying through a storm now, it was about being hunted. The thought sent a cold chill down her spine, but she pushed it aside. There was nothing to do but keep going. "We need to think about our next move," the captain continued, his voice firm. "If they're still tracking us, they might try again soon. We can't keep this up for long." Charlotte felt the weight of his words. They had only escaped one danger, but now they had to deal with the next. The idea of being constantly watched, hunted, was unsettling. But she wasn't the type to back down from a challenge. She had always thrived under pressure, and now was no different. "What about using the terrain?" Charlotte asked. "If we head over the mountains, we could use the terrain to hide our movements." The captain looked at her, surprised. "You think that'll work?" Charlotte nodded. "The radar might not pick us up as easily if we fly low enough over the peaks. We could hide behind the mountain range and throw them off course." The captain considered this, his eyes scanning the map in front of him. "It could work. It's risky, but it might be our best shot." They needed to make a decision fast. Charlotte's mind raced, trying to calculate every possibility. But the longer they stayed in the air, the higher the chances of being discovered. "We'll try it," the captain said finally, after a long pause. "Prepare yourself. We're going in low." Charlotte braced herself. She had no idea how low they'd have to fly or what dangers lay ahead, but she was ready to face whatever came next. The plane descended, slowly at first, as the captain adjusted the controls. The cabin grew quieter as the engines roared, the sound of the wind picking up outside. The altitude slowly dropped, and Charlotte could feel the change in pressure as they moved toward the mountains. The landscape below them started to shift. At first, there were rolling hills, but soon the peaks of the mountains rose sharply, jagged and tall. The clouds were starting to break apart, revealing the rugged terrain below. Charlotte's eyes were fixed on the view, her heart racing as they drew closer to the mountain range. The captain kept the plane steady, guiding them lower and lower. The wind howled outside as they skirted the base of the mountains, the ground moving rapidly beneath them. It was a dangerous maneuver, but they didn't have many choices left. If they could just stay out of sight long enough, they might be able to lose their pursuers. "We need to make it to the valley ahead," the captain said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "Once we're in there, we can hide for a while and plan our next move." The valley loomed ahead, a narrow passage through the mountains. Charlotte could see it clearly now, a natural escape route, but it was also a trap. If their pursuers were smart, they'd know exactly where they were heading. But there was no turning back. Charlotte held her breath as the plane continued its descent, the ground rushing up faster with each passing second. She could feel the tension in the cockpit as the captain and co-pilot worked in sync, maneuvering the plane with skill and precision. They had to get it right. One wrong move, and they could crash. As they entered the valley, the landscape around them changed once again. The mountains rose steeply on both sides, the narrow space between them cutting through the terrain like a canyon. The valley itself was covered in dense forest, the trees stretching high above the ground, their branches thick with green. It was the perfect hiding spot, but only if they could keep their speed under control. The captain glanced at Charlotte, his face set in concentration. "Here we go. Hold on." The plane dipped into the valley, the nose of the aircraft pointing downward as they followed the narrow path between the towering mountains. The trees below seemed to blur as they flew low, barely skimming the treetops. Charlotte gripped the armrests tightly, her knuckles white from the pressure. She could hear the engines roaring, the rush of air pressing against the plane as they fought to keep control. The moment seemed to stretch on forever, and for a brief second, Charlotte thought she might feel her heart stop. But the captain never faltered. His hands were steady, guiding the plane through the winding valley, navigating the treacherous terrain with incredible skill. Finally, they emerged from the valley, into a wider expanse of forest. The mountains now behind them, they had lost the direct path. For now, at least, they were safe. "We made it," the captain said, his voice a mix of relief and exhaustion. But Charlotte knew the danger wasn't over yet. They had escaped one threat, but there was no telling what would come next. The tension didn't ease once they had made it out of the valley. The forest spread out before them, quiet and dense, but Charlotte knew that silence could be deceiving. The captain kept the plane steady, his eyes constantly scanning the instruments, but he didn't slow down. They had to keep moving. "We've lost their signal for now," the captain said, his voice calm but laced with caution. "But I don't think they're giving up. They're tracking us somehow." Charlotte looked out the window, trying to make sense of the landscape below. The forest stretched endlessly, thick with trees and underbrush, but in the distance, the mountains rose higher, the terrain more rugged. They were deep in enemy territory now. The further they went, the less likely they were to find help. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. This was no longer just about surviving the flight, it was about escaping something much bigger. "We need to find a place to land," Charlotte said, her voice steady, but with a hint of urgency. "Somewhere safe. A small town, a hidden airstrip, anything." The captain shook his head. "There's nothing nearby. We're deep in the wilderness. Even if we land, there's no guarantee we'll be safe. They'll find us eventually." Charlotte's thoughts raced. What about the old airfield outside the mountains? "It's a small strip, but it's remote. I know a few people there. If we can get there, we might have a chance to hide." The captain glanced at her, considering the suggestion. "It's risky. We'll have to fly low again to avoid being seen." Charlotte's eyes met his, her resolve clear. "It's our best shot. We have to try." He didn't argue. The captain adjusted the plane's course, and Charlotte braced herself as they descended, flying low to the ground once again. The trees below were now thick with fog, the air damp and cool. She could feel the change in the environment: dense forests, rolling hills, and narrow paths that seemed to disappear into nothing. It felt as though they were flying through a forgotten world. The airstrip wasn't far, but Charlotte knew every second counted. They had to keep their altitude low enough to avoid being detected, but not so low that they risked crashing into the trees or the rugged hillsides. She watched the radar, keeping an eye on the incoming signals. Then, a sudden beep from the radar caught her attention. She glanced at the screen. There was movement. The pursuers had found them again. "They're back," the captain said, his voice tight with frustration. "We can't outrun them this time. We need to land." Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. The airstrip was close, but the distance was still too far. They were being hunted, and it was clear that whoever was after them wasn't going to stop. The urgency in the captain's voice only made her more determined. They had to make it. "Hold steady," Charlotte said, gripping the armrest. "We need to get there. Fast." The plane was flying lower now, the trees only feet away from the wings. Charlotte could feel the ground rushing toward them. The captain's hands were steady on the controls, guiding the plane through the dense fog, the trees narrowing in the distance. The moment of truth was near. The co-pilot spoke up, his voice tense. "We're not going to make it. We need to pull up. Now." Charlotte could feel the pressure mounting. They were dangerously close to the trees, and yet the airstrip was still just out of reach. She could see the edge of the forest now, but the pursuit was closing in, faster than she had expected. There was no way they could outrun them. Then, in a split second, a bright light flashed from above, a signal. The captain's eyes snapped to the sky, and Charlotte felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. They weren't just being followed, they were being watched. "Get ready," the captain shouted, as he adjusted the throttle, forcing the plane into a sharp turn. They had to lose them, or they were done. The plane jolted as it turned, the engines roaring with power, and Charlotte's body pressed back against the seat. The wind outside whipped through the air, but Charlotte didn't dare look away from the horizon. They had to get to the airstrip. No other options. The signal flashed again, brighter this time. And then, as if the heavens had opened up, the fog cleared just enough for Charlotte to see it: an old, run-down airfield, barely visible through the dense trees. It was just ahead. "We're almost there," Charlotte shouted, her voice rising above the noise of the engines. "We can make it." But as they neared the airstrip, a sudden shockwave of air hit the plane, throwing it off course. Charlotte's stomach lurched as the plane swerved, barely missing a thick cluster of trees. "We're too close," the captain yelled. "Prepare for emergency landing." Charlotte's heart pounded. There was no time to waste. She reached over and grabbed the controls from the captain's hands. He looked at her in surprise, but there was no time for hesitation. She had flown in simulation exercises before, now was the time to trust that training. Steady. Charlotte ordered, her voice sharp. Keep it level. Together, they brought the plane down, the wheels skimming the grass just as a sharp whistle filled the air. They had done it. They had made it to the ground. But as they touched down on the cracked runway, Charlotte knew that this wasn't the end. The pursuit was still out there, waiting. And whatever lay ahead, they would have to face it together. The plane skidded to a halt, its wheels scraping against the cracked runway. Charlotte's heart was racing. They had made it to the airstrip, but the job wasn't done yet. The danger was still very real. The moment they had touched down, she felt the weight of everything that was at stake. Get out, now, the captain ordered, his voice urgent. Charlotte unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, her mind racing. They had landed, but the question was, for how long would they be safe? She glanced at the small, dilapidated hangar ahead. It looked abandoned, exactly what they needed. No one would expect them to land here, in the middle of nowhere. But would it be enough to hide them from their pursuers? The captain followed her, his eyes scanning the horizon. We can't stay here for long, he said, his voice grim. They'll be tracking us soon enough. We need to move fast. Charlotte nodded, already moving toward the side door. The air outside was cool, the ground covered in damp grass. She could hear the sound of rustling leaves as the wind picked up, but there were no sounds of engines or voices yet. The co-pilot was the last to exit, his face tense. We should find cover, he said, his eyes darting around. They'll be looking for us. Charlotte turned to him. We'll head to the hangar. It's the best option. We can hide inside until we figure out our next move. They moved quickly toward the hangar, staying low to avoid being seen. The airstrip was surrounded by thick trees and tall grass, providing some cover, but not much. Charlotte felt the eyes of her team on her, waiting for her to make the next move. She wasn't used to being the one in charge of this kind of situation, but right now, she was the one who had to make the decisions. As they reached the hangar, the captain stopped and turned to Charlotte. We don't have much time. If they have air support, they'll find us. Charlotte took a deep breath. Then we'll have to move fast. The hangar doors were old and rusted, but they still opened. The inside was dark and dusty, with old tools scattered around. It was the perfect place to hide, at least for now. Charlotte led the way inside, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. Once inside, they quickly moved to the back corner, where a few crates and piles of old equipment could provide some cover. The captain checked his watch. We need to be ready, he said. They could be here at any moment. Charlotte crouched behind a large crate, her mind racing. She had no idea what their pursuers had in mind, but she knew they wouldn't stop until they found them. They were playing a dangerous game, and it was only a matter of time before they were found. She glanced over at the captain, who was peering out from behind the crates. What's our next move? She asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he kept watching the horizon, his eyes narrowed. We can't stay here, he finally said. We need to find a way to signal for help. Charlotte knew he was right. If they stayed here too long, they would be trapped. We'll need a plan, she said. But first, we need to figure out who's after us. The co-pilot crouched beside them, his face grim. I've been thinking about that, he said. Whoever they are, they know exactly where we are. They've been tracking us for too long. Charlotte nodded. That's what I'm afraid of. Suddenly, a distant noise broke the silence. The faint hum of engines. Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. They were here. Get down, the captain hissed, his voice low but urgent. They all dropped to the ground, pressing themselves flat against the cold floor. The noise grew louder, and Charlotte could feel the vibration in the air as something large approached. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just one aircraft, it was a whole fleet. The sound of engines was overwhelming now, shaking the walls of the hangar. The captain looked over at Charlotte, his face grim. "We have to do something now." Charlotte's mind raced. They couldn't stay hidden forever. They needed to act, and fast. "We'll need to make a run for it," she said, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "There's a small forest just beyond the airstrip. If we can make it there, we might be able to lose them." The captain nodded. "It's a long shot, but it's better than staying here." They had no choice. Charlotte knew the odds were slim, but they had to take a chance. She motioned for the others to follow her, and they began to move quickly toward the exit of the hangar. The engines outside were growing louder, and they knew they had little time. As they stepped out into the open, Charlotte led the way, running as fast as she could toward the tree line. The wind whipped past her, the sound of engines filling the air. Her legs burned from the effort, but she didn't slow down. There was no time to stop. She glanced behind her, just in time to see a flash of light in the distance. A helicopter. It was getting closer. "We're almost there," she shouted to the others, her voice rising above the wind. But deep down, she knew that even if they made it to the forest, the fight wasn't over. The real battle was just beginning. Charlotte's breath came in sharp gasps as she sprinted toward the forest, the sound of the helicopter growing louder behind her. The trees ahead were just within reach, but she could hear the whirling blades getting closer, the thumping of the helicopter's engines reverberating through the air. She glanced back quickly. There was no time to waste. The helicopter was closing in fast. "Keep moving," she shouted over her shoulder, urging the captain and co-pilot to push forward. They were all running as fast as they could, their feet pounding the ground beneath them. The forest was getting closer, but they had to make it there before the helicopter found them. The trees were now just ahead, their thick trunks forming a wall of green. Charlotte's heart raced, her legs burning with the effort, but she didn't dare slow down. The helicopter was almost on top of them. She could see it now, cutting through the sky like a predator hunting its prey. They had no time to waste. As they reached the tree line, Charlotte led them into the thick woods, weaving between the trees. The dense forest offered some cover, but it wasn't enough. She could still hear the helicopter's blades slicing through the air, the sound getting louder and louder with each passing second. "Get low!" Charlotte shouted. "Stay out of sight." The captain and co-pilot immediately dropped to the ground, flattening themselves against the forest floor. Charlotte followed, her body hitting the ground with a thud as she crawled through the underbrush. The leaves rustled beneath her, but she barely noticed. All that mattered now was staying hidden. The helicopter hovered just above the trees, its spotlight scanning the ground. Charlotte held her breath, praying they wouldn't be seen. She could see the bright light cutting through the dark forest, searching for them. Every second felt like an eternity. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The spotlight moved slowly, sweeping back and forth across the trees. Charlotte's pulse raced. She could feel the heat of the spotlight as it swept just inches away from where they lay. Her body was tense, every muscle screaming for her to move, but she knew if they made a sound, they were done for. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the helicopter's spotlight moved farther away. Charlotte dared to peek through the leaves, her eyes straining in the darkness. She could see the helicopter drifting away, its engine noise slowly fading. They were being given a brief moment of safety. "Move," Charlotte whispered urgently, pushing herself up from the ground. "We have to keep moving." The others didn't hesitate. They all stood quickly, the captain leading the way as they made their way deeper into the forest. The helicopter might have moved on, but Charlotte knew this wasn't over yet. They couldn't afford to relax. The forest was their only cover, but it wouldn't protect them forever. They ran through the trees, careful to stay low and keep as quiet as possible. The night was quiet, save for the sounds of their footsteps and the distant noises of the helicopter's engines. It was a tense silence, and Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Even though the helicopter had moved away, she knew there was still a chance they could be found. After a few minutes, the sound of the helicopter seemed to disappear. Charlotte's heart still raced, but she allowed herself a quick glance at the others. They were all running as fast as they could, their faces set in determination. But the fatigue was beginning to show. The captain's breathing was heavy, his steps slower than before, and the co-pilot was glancing over his shoulder every few seconds, as if expecting the helicopter to return at any moment. Charlotte knew they couldn't keep this pace up much longer. They needed a place to hide, a real hideout, somewhere they could regroup and plan their next move. But they were deep in the forest now, and the nearest town was miles away. The odds were stacked against them. "We need to find shelter," Charlotte said, her voice steady despite the panic clawing at the back of her mind. "There's an old cabin a few miles east from here. It's abandoned. We can stay there." The captain nodded, clearly exhausted but willing to follow her lead. "Lead the way," he said. Charlotte took a deep breath and began moving eastward, weaving through the trees. The others followed closely behind, their eyes scanning the forest around them for any signs of movement. The further they went, the denser the trees became, and the more the sounds of the helicopter faded into the background. They moved cautiously, staying low and using the trees for cover. Charlotte's mind raced. She knew they weren't safe yet. Even if they made it to the cabin, there was still the chance that the helicopter would circle back, or worse, that they would be found by ground troops. But she had to keep moving. She couldn't let them stop now. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the cabin. It was small and old, its wooden walls weathered by time, but it was still standing. Charlotte quickly pushed open the door, and they all hurried inside, closing it quietly behind them. Inside, it was dark and musty, but it was safe for now. Charlotte let out a sigh of relief and collapsed onto an old wooden chair. The others sat down beside her, their exhaustion evident on their faces. "We made it," the captain said quietly. But Charlotte knew it wasn't over. They had escaped for now, but the danger was still out there. She looked around the small cabin, her mind already planning the next steps. They couldn't stay here long. They had to keep moving. The helicopter might have passed, but the pursuit was far from over.